G'day everybody and welcome to Future Whenua Yarns. I'm Zeb.
And Rob.
This week we're speaking with the team from CarbonCrop. This is the last of the series of the short speak talks that were at the summit. And we had this conversation a while ago just to follow up from what Nick presented at the summit.
Absolutely, yeah. So in CarbonCrop are doing some pretty innovative things around, sort of taking the regulatory burden out of the worry of the landowner, I suppose, in a lot of ways. They're sort of digitizing that process around
so basically there's this huge opportunity with the ETS and trading carbon credits on farm, and it's a huge topic right now. How do we do this carbon accounting? And we're going to get charged for the emission side of things, but it's actually how do we sequester that carbon that's up in the air? And if you've got a huge block of forestry, it's quite more simple. If you've got anything else, it can be a little complex, and it's that sort of burden and the hoop jumping in the regulatory process that CarbonCrop are here to help and really create some value for farmers and land stewards that are really trying to do the thing in sequestering carbon and all the other benefits that come with.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a strange dichotomy where we're being carried towards this future of intense scrutiny around sequestration and emission of carbon, but there is always that thing of like, no, now you've got, there's a burden that now we've got to be measuring and tracking and doing all that kind of thing. And it always surprised me that government doesn't go, if we, make this as easy as humanly possible, we're going to get a much higher uptake of these kinds of schemes. Instead, it just becomes, well, there's going to be punishment if you don't. So, it's sort of leading with the carrot versus the stick, I suppose, there. And I think, a company like CarbonCrop has a way of really streamlining that process for a bunch of people, which is going to make a lot more people actually get into the scheme. Yeah,
well, what I think is really amazing about what they've done in their service is 80% of the clientele and the land covered in their scheme is indigenous forest.
Oh, fantastic.
And that's quite contrasting to the norm of the ETS, which really incentivise blanket pines, which are easy to put through, and not a time to go on a pine rant here.
It's just
it'll end up as a long intro if we got going there. So it's amazing. They're using it's essentially just a tech platform, a software that helps analyse land and provide value for farmers.
Yeah, absolutely. So taking GIS data and making it work for the farmers. I think that's great.
Yeah. So with that, we'll lead you first into the presentation that Nick gave us, we watched at the summit, and then into the yarn that ensued.
And stand by for Zeb's beard to disappear.
Well, it's funny as well, actually, because he talks about this. We were going to gather and have a webinar, sort of interactive series following it. And re-watching just before Nick saying that in this presentation, I was like, that was sort of the origins of this podcast. Yeah. Was going to be a short series of interactive webinars following the summit, and it's sort of become what we're doing now.
Yeah, so thank you, CarbonCrop. You have no idea what you've let loose. So, yeah.
Very good. Enjoy.
Kia ora, Future Whenua Summit. I'm Nick from CarbonCrop, and I'll start by saying thanks to Zeb for the invitation to speak, and sorry to miss the summit in person. I'm sure that wherever you guys are today is a lot more nicely appointed than my sort of blue box with interrogation room lighting. I've been leading the CarbonCrop team since we got started back in 2020, and our mission is to address the climate and biodiversity crisis by protecting and restoring millions of hectares of high biodiversity forest around the world. We do this by working with like-minded landholders of all shapes and sizes to get them access to carbon credits, which recognise the good that they're doing, and then help them take those credits to market so that they can get paid for the good that they're doing. So carbon credits and carbon markets, unless you've been living in a cave for the last sort of few years, you'd know that these are a pretty hot issue in a lot of circles. And there are certainly some legitimate criticisms in some ways that they can go wrong. We focus on making them go right, and in particular we specialise in native forest restoration. And when they go right, they're amazing, and they represent a massive opportunity to finally direct some serious money towards forest protection and restoration. For a sense of the potential, and taking the example of New Zealand, there's a goal which we very much support, communicated by the Climate Change Commission, of creating 1.5 million hectares of new native forest across the country over the next decade or so. So that much forest could sequester 15 million tonnes of carbon a year, which even at current prices would mean more than $1.1 billion in payments per year to the landholders creating and restoring that forest. And to put that in context, the $1 billion Trees Fund had around $500 million allocated to it in total over the entire term of the program. And another point of reference, the Department of Conservation's total annual budget is around $600 million per year. So in terms of opportunity here, we're talking about a new source of funding directed to forest restoration, which is equivalent to twice the current total DOC budget. So carbon markets for forestry have a huge amount of potential to do good. That can be enabled here. The trick is making sure that the money goes to the right purposes and that people are actually able to access it without just sort of getting caught up in friction in the system. So these markets, the New Zealand ETS is one of these markets, and it currently pays hundreds of millions of dollars a year to forest owners. Unfortunately, only a small fraction of that to native forest, which is what we're working to change. But we're actually really lucky to have the New Zealand ETS. It's a really good foundation to have that a lot of countries would be envious of, to build sort of funding for native forest on top of. It's just pretty complicated and not especially user-friendly, and this is a major reason why there's so little native forest registered. So to give a sense of the challenge, to be registered in the ETS, your forest needs to be at least 1 hectare in area, at least 30 metres wide, be able to reach at least 5 metres in the environment in which it's growing, given the tree species you have, and have at least 30% canopy cover, and to have been established after 1989, and you have to be able to prove all of this to high confidence if you want the regulator to accept your registration and give you the carbon credits. Now this is moderately challenging even if you've got a big block of pine, but it's even more challenging if you've got a mixed tapestry of regenerating native bush and various species and various history and possible environmental limiting factors. And that what I just described is all of the kinds of forest which we most want to protect and restore. Like they are mixed, they are diverse, they are varied. So when we started talking to landholders, we found that these hurdles, especially for native forest, had meant that many of them just tended to throw up their hands in the air and give up, which is pretty understandable, but unfortunately that means that they don't get paid, and we don't direct funds to native forest as much as we could, and that's sad. So what we do is take away this hassle and focus on getting them the funds so that they can focus on their land. We do all of this for no upfront cost. We only get paid a share of the proceeds if the registration is successful, which nicely ties our mission back to our commercial success. We only get paid if we're actually sucking carbon out of the air. We offer a free assessment service via our website. To confirm eligibility, a landholder just has to go there, click on their land, and then they get a summary of what their potential carbon credit return would be and their likely income, so they can quickly understand where they sit in terms of the possibilities that are available to them. When you put all of this together, it's an enormous opportunity for a range of landholders in New Zealand, both those looking to create new native forest and especially those with early stage regeneration, which might be starved of funds and attention. And once we get this carbon funding, it can pay for all sorts of things to help that forest prosper, including pest control, weed control, planting activities, sourcing of seedlings, and also, pragmatically, pay for the mortgage on the land, because the land where all of this forest has to go isn't free. Someone has to cover the costs and the opportunity costs, and to a huge extent that's what this funding can achieve. This has been going really well. There's a lot of urgency now to get forest registered in the ETS, and we're very proud that more than 80% of our forest land under contract is regenerating indigenous forest versus less than 10% in the ETS on average. More than anything, we're grateful to the landholders we're working with for taking the time to actually look into this as an opportunity, understand it, and for their general passion for being good stewards of their land and leave something positive to future generations. We've talked to hundreds of farmers now. We've got more than 20,000 hectares of land registered in our platform in terms of the farms that are engaged, and there hasn't been a single mean-spirited, environmentally indifferent farmer amongst that entire bunch. They all care about forest, they all care about creating a stronger future and strong environmental integrity. It's just finding a way to get the funds so they can actually afford to do so. We're very keen to keep working to grow our impact through partnerships with landholders, but also others in this space, because just like the forest that we're working with, this whole biodiversity and climate environment is very much an ecosystem. And while we specialise in carbon sequestration through forest restoration, we realise that's just one part of the puzzle. So please get in touch to find out more about getting paid to restore carbon by restoring forest, but also please get in touch if you see a way that what we're doing could fit in with what you're doing or what others are doing, because we're extremely keen to collaborate and help everybody succeed. One quick thing before I wrap up. While the ETS has many great points, as those of you who have worked with it a bit may be aware, it's still a bit of a work in progress, and especially historically it's been very difficult to get certain classes of regenerating native forest registered in the ETS. We're working on some new solutions here in parallel with the ETS, which we're very excited about. We should have more to share here soon. Okay, I promised Zeb I'd keep this short. Probably already broken that promise. We're arranging a Q&A follow-up seminar about native forest at 2 p.m. on Thursday, April 7th for anyone who wants to go deeper into this topic. Please let Zeb know if you're interested, and he's also kindly offered to compile some questions from the summit and ask them on behalf at that seminar in case you're unable to attend on the day. We'll then make a recording available afterwards via Future Whenua and CarbonCrop's websites. Thanks again for your time and attention. I hope you found this interesting, or that if you didn't, you took the chance to nip out and grab a quick coffee. I'm really looking forward to your questions, and I hope you join for the seminar, and either way, I hope to meet many of you in person at some point in the near future. Thanks a lot.
Kia ora, good to be with the three of you. Yeah, really good to be having this conversation, which is a continuation from the sort of short video that you primed us with at the summit. And yeah, so really Future Whenua is just about this exploration of what are the options available for the future of our land use, and what actions do we take now as we head there. So it was very high level. It's regenerative agriculture is a part of that, restoration's a part of that, green technologies are a part of that. And so, yeah, we're really wanting to bring people from right across the rural sector and participate in this conversation. And so, being the climate it was, we had a mixture of live speakers and some pre-recorded and some live Zooms. And so your video, Nick, which maybe we can use at the start of this video to launch into it. But yeah, your video, Nick, about just 5 minutes covering what CarbonCrop is and what the ETS, where we're going and what the opportunity is there, especially financially. It was some pretty significant figures you're putting out there. So yeah, just wanting to really elaborate on some of those ideas in this conversation. And so I wondered if we could just really start on, for those who aren't aware of the ETS, or you're participating in this carbon market, just for like a 30,000 foot view of that whole landscape.
Yeah, I can have a crack at that, I guess. Firstly, thanks very much in the other direction for giving us the opportunity to be involved. Especially after I saw the videos of the event, I was even more sad not to have been there in person. It looks like it was hugely successful, and it was fantastic for us to be able to try and get some of our story through as well. Yeah, on what CarbonCrop does, and this is sort of repeating things a little bit, like we try and make it easy for landholders who are looking to restore forest to interact with the ETS. So yeah, natural question there that you asked is, what is it that they're interacting with? What's the ETS? What's the point of it? ETS is emissions trading scheme. They exist all across the world, and well, not all across the world. A lot of countries have kind of been a bit late to the party, but New Zealand's been at the forefront of it, really internationally, and it's the New Zealand ETS. So it's basically a set of rules and some marketplaces that is government regulated. That's about those people who have to either surrender carbon credits and pay money for them. So like if you're the whole goal of the ETS is help New Zealand to reduce its emissions. Like create an economic framework which reduces New Zealand's emissions, so that if someone pollutes, they have to pay for it, which means that they're going to be incentivized to pollute less. If somebody can suck pollution, in this case the pollution we're talking about is generally carbon dioxide, out of the atmosphere, you pay them to do it. Like you balance these up, and you'd hope that, especially as you start to crank up the number and we go from $3 carbon credits, which was the sort of low point, was actually even lower, I think sort of $1.50 back in the early 2010s, up to sort of $75 plus where we are now, and it's expected to go rapidly north. Like the way markets work is you can just keep winding that number up, and eventually you will get a significant reduction in emissions. There are a whole heap of other problems, like it can go wrong. You don't want to wind it up too quickly if it's not really realistic for the broader economy to respond, because we don't want to actually inflict hardship on people. We don't want economic collapse. We just want a sensible, staged, effective reduction of carbon dioxide emissions. So the way the ETS works, if you're a big emitter in New Zealand, and you'd know if you were one, every litre of petrol that you buy in New Zealand from a petrol station is subject to 100% carbon tax. Like you're paying tax on the CO2 emissions that are going to come with it when you buy the litre of petrol as part of the petrol price. The person who actually buys the carbon credits there is like the petrol importer, or I'm not actually sure exactly how it works, but like Z Petroleum, for example, they've definitely got a big interest in the ETS because they have surrender obligations under the ETS. That means that they have to get carbon credits and take them from somewhere and basically write them off. They don't get to sell them again to anybody else. They're gone. And they have to do that in order to be allowed to emit in the form of selling petrol. And there's a lot of different emitter profiles. It's not always CO2. Certain refrigerants, for example, are extremely strong greenhouse gases. So I don't actually know the names of them, but certain air conditioning active fluids, for example, if you want to have a kilo of that, you might have to buy 1,000 kilos of carbon credits in order to offset the difference because they're such strong sort of global warming agents. But there are all sorts of different emitters. The thing all of those emitters have in common is that they have to get carbon credits from somewhere in order to be allowed to continue to emit. And as the price of those credits goes up, the cost for them to continue to emit goes up, which means that they'll try and find ways to emit less. And if you're Genesis Energy, that might mean that you move to more efficient power plants or solar or wind. If you're Z Petroleum, it might be that you don't change directly, but rather your customers see the price of fuel going up and they start moving to electric cars or hybrids, like some way to get the cost signal coming through. The other side of it, which is more where we get involved, is where do these carbon credits come from? And they come from two places primarily. Firstly, the government just issues them into the market. Like New Zealand is not yet a zero carbon economy. It's trying to be, and we're going to get there, but we're not there yet. And the non-zero part of the whole thing comes from the government just every year putting tens of millions of tons of carbon credits available via auction, not backed by sequestration, just saying we're okay if we emit, I think it's about 60 million tons a year at the moment. That's all right. It's a bit less, Patrick. I think 60 million is maybe the total, and 20 million is the amount that will typically be auctioned into the scheme. I can't remember. I don't know if you remember the numbers exactly.
Not exactly, but sounds about right.
It's about 20 million tons. But then, in addition to that, though, there's carbon credits are issued for sequestration, which is what we really want to do. Like, don't just like go, well, it sucks, but we're not zero carbon yet. Let's make some emissions available. Actually go, these people over here who want to emit, wouldn't it be good if we could actually balance the scales there by sucking the carbon out of the air? This is what trees are pretty damn good at doing and have been doing for a while. And if we find a smart way to do more of that, especially with sort of higher biodiversity, high durability, long-lived native forest that also improves environmental resilience and water quality and everything else, you suck a ton of carbon out of the air and you can prove it, you get a carbon credit. And you can go and sell that carbon credit to someone who wants the right to emit, and you get money, which you can use to plant more trees or retire more land or whatever it is. So it's very much just a marketplace. The goal of the marketplace is reduce the carbon intensity of our economy. And it's mostly working pretty well. Like, it didn't work very well when the price was so low because everyone's like, I'm emitting, I don't care. And the money wasn't enough to encourage anybody to create a carbon forest. But now that we're getting sort of well into the upper half of the $100 bracket, it's really positive. And it does have some perverse things, like there's lots of concerns around the incentives for change of land use. So, it can blow up in your face when it's successful as well. And so you have to start tweaking the policy levers and go, maybe we won't give carbon credits to this category because honestly, it's got some negative externalities and we don't want that many pine trees just blanketing high productivity farmland. And that's great. But it's not the ETS that's bad. It's some of the settings within the ETS, and there's maybe certain categories that it would make sense to exclude in the future. Don't know if that's the 30,000 foot view. It was probably, I got down a bit in the weeds, but
zoomed down a bit lower parts of that, but it was awesome. You made a really clear picture of quite a complex thing going on. So nice there. You mentioned in the first video that other countries might be jealous of New Zealand's ETS. How is it different in our country than it is globally?
There's two major ways that I'm aware of. Firstly, it's been there for a while and it's actually quite robust and widely adopted. Like there's certain categories in New Zealand that have got a free pass, like agriculture, at least up until now. They've sort of got an emissions entitlement that they don't have to pay for. But it's not like it's just, you guys you get it for free. It's all about this, like, it's not intended to be a whip that you beat people with. It's intended to be a collective nationwide way to try and incentivize a shift in behavior. And agriculture will get phased in, might not be into the ETS. They might come up with a new scheme under Hawaka Kanoa, but there is responsibility there. And from all of the farmers we've talked to, like, they take the responsibility seriously and they're on board with it. Other countries are not there yet in that regard. They're just like, oh, yep, got a lot of beef. That's how it is, I guess. Or even for fuel, like, or coal or whatever. They're just like, yep, we burn a lot of coal. We're going to try and burn less coal. They usually still, especially if they're sort of in this, I forget basically the non-developing economies category, which have different obligations under the International Panel for Climate Change. They've still got international obligations. They're like, we're going to try and do this stuff. But it's really hard for them to actually, as a country, achieve those goals because they don't have any way to kind of like efficiently encourage people to do things. Like they go, all right, we've got to try and, it was really embarrassing last time I went to the COP26. Everyone made fun of our country. We've got to do better. Let's try and come up with sort of incentive payments to help create solar farms. But it's like, it's really fiddly, and you're kind of getting involved in little segments of the economy, and you create all these perverse incentives. Whereas if you just said, we want to emit less, we've got this marketplace that works to encourage reduced emissions, have at it, then you get quite an efficient result. Like New Zealand has been improving quite well. To the extent that it hasn't been improving, it's been because the price signal's been too weak for a while. But it's definitely doing what it's supposed to do. Petrol prices will start to rise. Fossil fuel prices will start to rise. Renewables will become even more competitive. It'll become even more attractive to have an electric car. All of the things but you don't have to go and like individually give people $1 here and $1 there. There's just this big marketplace that's quite efficient. And the other side of it is that like there's lots of concerns around carbon forestry, and rightly so, as even in the context of pines, like it can go badly wrong. Like you can end up with just like mistaken incentives for land uses that you don't want. But it's not a trick. Like trees are really, really good at sucking carbon out of the air and storing it in wood. And where it's the right thing to have happen, and you do want to encourage the land use change, having a big mechanism where you can actually go, you did the thing I want you to do, here's some money. Also, if you keep doing it, you can rely on that happening in the future. It's hugely powerful as an incentive for behavior change. And most countries just don't have it. And they're like, oh, I wish people would plant more forests. I'll carry on wishing. Maybe they'll have some targeted program where they say, oh, we'll give you $10 a tree or whatever. But they tend to be quite short-lived, and then the auditing's not in place and the trees die and yada, yada, yada. Just saying, suck out the carbon and I'll give you some money, screw it up and I want my money back. It's really, really good. And it's quite well. I would say, I think New Zealand is probably, maybe along with California, essentially the world leader in forest carbon market maturity. And the New Zealand one is, in my view, way, way better. Like California, you don't get a look in unless you've got 1,000 hectares plus. We routinely register people with sort of 2, 3, 5 hectares kind of territory. It's very accessible, it's highly democratized, anyone can participate, rather than just being a sort of a thing for the massive mega forestry companies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when we first got in contact, I was searching on how we could get some carbon credits for our 5 hectare block on the farm. So it's pretty cool that you offer that service to guys like us that don't want to dive too deep into the weeds about how this all works.
Yep.
So CarbonCrop, what is your service? And you mentioned that it's 80% of what you deal with is in native restoration, which is awesome because so much of this carbon trading and ETS and plantation is focused on radiator pines. Just how does CarbonCrop function, and how do you orientate towards native plantings?
Yeah, great question. It's been kind of a happy consequence of just the nature of the product that we're offering. Like, we're not anti-exotics. I think actually forestry is an enormously valuable industry for New Zealand, and it's a huge, like, every time I build a new retaining wall on my property, I'm like, my God, timber's expensive these days. And like, there's supply demand factors. Like, we need trees. They're great. I've got no problem with exotic forest production. You don't want to have perverse incentives where you end up like basically just planting weed species across large areas of the landscape, which are going to be a fire risk and are never going to be controlled. Like that, we're not against. But our general approach has been lots of farmers have opportunities here that they don't necessarily know about, or landholders generally. They don't necessarily know how big the opportunity is. It's a real complicated thing to kind of get your head into and understand what your obligations are going to be and what your entitlements are going to be. And then it's really complicated again to actually go through the whole process of getting them. And we're basically like, we've got the system which is supposed to help incentivize people to take these certain behaviors like restoring forest and protecting forest, but it's too hard for them to do. So they're not doing it. And then you don't necessarily get restored protected forest. You might get like just unmaintained forest or even cleared forest, or in the worst scenario, from our perspective, they can't register the sort of relatively high biodiversity regenerating native forest for whatever reason. So they clear it and they plant it out in pines instead, which are easier to register. It's like, that's insanity. It's like you had exactly the thing that we all want to try and create, but it was too hard. So you got rid of it and you put in the thing which is still pretty good at sucking carbon, but possibly not what we want in that scenario. So yeah, we basically, the whole goal was make it easy for the landholders to do the thing that everybody wants them to do when it makes sense for them to do it, across all types. So we register plenty of exotic forest when that's what the farmer has, and they're like, yep, this is my wood block, I'm looking to do X. So they're like, cool, well, that's fine. Like we happily haven't yet had to get into the situation where we're sort of, someone comes to us and says, I'm looking at planting out all of my LUC 1 and 2 paddocks and pines. And we go, okay, well, we don't think that's cool. So no, but until now it just hasn't really happened because those tend to be the easier ones. Like, and the big forestry conversions, they were never really our target because you've got a massive forest, it's in a paddock, it's pretty clear cut what's there and what's not. People will just register it by themselves. Where we can help is with the slightly weirder cases or the slightly smaller cases, and most of those have just turned out to tend to be regenerating indigenous, highly biodiverse forest, which is fantastic because that's absolutely what we're the most excited about. And that's where we can help the most as well, because they're the most complicated to map, they're the most complicated to prove the history of, they're the most complicated to deliver ongoing monitoring of. And these are all things which can be the difference between, the whole company started, like we sort of had the concept of, hey, maybe we can help here. Went and talked to the first landholder, who was just a guy I knew over on Banks Peninsula, a friend of my parents. He had 60 hectare block, about 30 hectares of it was regenerating Manuka and Kanuka. Like, I walked through it, it's like super nice. I was like, so have you got that in the ETS? And I was like, no. Like, why not? Oh, well, I actually looked at it 3 or 4 times and every time it was just too hard. I'm like, oh, well, that's a bugger. I wonder what it's worth. Went and crunched the numbers. Like, you're about to miss out on $45,000 if you don't do something about this. It used to be $30,000, but the numbers have gone up because the carbon credits are worth more now. You're about to miss out on 45K. What do you do? He's like, I don't know how to do it. Like, I could hire someone. The outcome's uncertain. It might not work out. And we're like, okay, well, how about if we just did it all for you? If it plays out, you give us 10%. If it doesn't play out, like, you're in the clear. You haven't lost a thing. He's like, that's a no-brainer. Done. And then it worked, and now he's got the money. And like, that's been a super compelling thing for all of the landholders we've talked to. Just, yeah, I love it. I can't lose. You take away all of the trouble. I philosophically completely agree with what you're doing, and it's what I want to do. Just make it easy. Don't force me to jump through hoops. I'm already busy as hell. Like, especially like sort of the lifestyle block holders, they've maybe got a little more time in certain respects, but the farmers, like, the last thing that they need is another round of compliance obligations and monitoring and reporting and everything else. If you just say, we'll take care of that for you, and you get paid and you get almost all of the money for no risk, yeah, it's sort of, it's not like there's a dirty part to it as well. It's like, and the outcome is something that every day you'll be able to look at it and be happy and proud about it as well. And yeah, it hasn't been a particularly hard product to sell in many respects.
Yeah.
More of these people than me, and I'm conscious I'm talking all of the time. So, you'll take 2 for that, and Natalie.
Yeah, I was going to just say that was a good sort of summary there, Nick. But I was just going to add that we do target a section of the rural landscape, or rural people who are perhaps underserved by the existing industry as well. There's quite a few consultants who do ETS registrations around the country, and understandably that they pick off the low-hanging fruit. I mean, why would you want to go and register or help someone register 2 hectares of regenerating native forest, and the person might only earn like a couple of grand a year out of it, when you can go and help someone plant 500 hectares of pine trees, do half their work, and they're earning tenfold or more that the amount of carbon credits out of for minimal effort. So traditionally, these smaller blocks or regenerating native blocks have found it hard to get help from the existing forestry consultants out there, and we've found that being able to serve them has really helped out those people. And our technology platform really helps us to be able to scale that. So we can deal with lots of different people, rather than just pouring labor and energy into these blocks. We can get the technology to do quite a bit of the work, which is great. Really helps out the landowner, because obviously we don't have to charge as much to do the same job.
Yeah.
How does your technology work? Maybe without getting too technical, because even just on your website, I know to employ our listeners to go on there, because it's good fun even just looking through and seeing the different blocks around us. We're scoping out who my neighbours are and extended neighbours, and so I like that tool as it is. But so once I've sent through, these are our plots. What does the technology do to calculate the carbon potential?
It kind of, there's going to sound like a whole bunch of buzzwords and bingo, but basically at heart, we're an artificial intelligence company as well. And that was sort of our provenance. And we essentially train machines to look at all sorts of satellite imagery data and terrain data and this kind of thing, and be really good at figuring out where the forests are, down to like the meter level. And it's the kind of thing that you can do it by hand, but nobody does, because it takes you forever. And we know, because we've done it by hand for the first couple just to get it working. And it sort of comes down to, what do you need to register within the ETS? You need to have a really precise map of the boundary of where your forest is now and where it was in the past. And you can register the difference between those two. For a big block of pine, it's not necessarily that hard. It's actually still harder than you might think. But you're sort of like, there's a big block and before there was nothing. So I'm just going to draw around the edge, done. Can get trickier than that in certain circumstances, but compare that with, well, I've got this really spirally, windy gully, and I had a little bit of stuff up through the middle of it back in sort of 1985, and now it's all like this, Rorschach test of forest around the edges of it, like crazy blobs and everything. If you want to register that, you have to do precise drawing around all of that, taking out the old stuff and including only the new stuff that actually counts as forest land, which is based on a certain species mix. And it's the kind of thing that computers were created for, like really, really repetitive, easy to make mistakes. Mistakes can actually cost you in penalties and non-compliance, and versus just like training machine vision algorithms to do it quickly for you and then verify it. That's the core of our tech. And then we've got a whole platform built around it, which puts in like, what rates do you earn carbon at? What species do you have? What other data sources can we use to support your application? We've pulled in all of the historic imagery data for all of New Zealand that we can find over the past sort of 40 to 50 years. We've boosted the resolution of it using some proprietary algorithms so that we've got like a better picture of what was there in the past than anybody else that we know of in the country. And all of this is basically, the user generally doesn't see this. Like, landholders don't care about this. They just want their forest registered. But if you want your forest registered successfully, you have to pull all of this together and include it in the application. And we've now automated large amounts of that. Sort of continuing on from what Patrick was saying as well, I think that's a fantastic addition. Like, we didn't really, or at least when we started, I thought that we would sort of be the solution for the littler guy. what's been incredible is that, like, we've got 10,000 hectare plus stations registered with us now. They're like, solve my problem. Nobody wants to go and, because like if you got a 10,000 hectare forest block, you're just drawing the same rectangle. I mean, I'm oversimplifying here, but it's still not that hard. It's just bigger. A 10,000 hectare station that's sort of mixed use production, it's like drawing that really complicated picture on a 10 hectare station times 1,000. Like it's just linearly worse, and it's impossible. And that's why the consultants that Patrick mentioned, like, you look at that as a job, and you're like, nah, that does not look like a fun way to spend 4 weeks. And they had nobody serving them for the most part. And so it's really almost been a surprise how attractive our solution is to the huge end as well, especially as we've been able to refine it a bit. But yeah, at the heart of it, from what the user sees, we've basically tried to go to our map, click your land, we go off and do a whole bunch of number crunching, and we come back with where we think your eligible forest is, how much each bit of it is worth to you, and what you're going to have to do in order to claim it. And then you go, yes, no, actually I've got other plans for this section here. You might not realize yet, but I cut that forest down last week, so it's not there anymore. Please register the remainder. We go off and do a whole bunch of other evidence collection and number crunching, and then we submit an application to MPI, the regulator for the market, and they come back with a registration, and we manage it. And you get paid in carbon credits into an account which is owned entirely by the landholder. We don't kind of hold them on behalf or anything. And then now there's a secondary markets which are very efficient. You can sell them for money, and you get money from restoring your trees.
Yeah, I think the point you're making, Nick, as well, that a lot of people don't necessarily know that they want to register their land yet. All they want to know is, what's all this stuff about? Can I even get any carbon credits for my land or for the forest that I already have? And that's why we offer this free assessment via the website. So you can basically go on, find your block, click yes, please, and we can do that remotely without needing to visit your land. And then you get basically a free PDF report that maps out what your eligibility is and what your carbon forecast could be, what you could earn. And then you can decide whether or not you want to proceed. And if you do, and it makes sense for you and your property and your family and all the rest of it, then we can help you proceed to registration. And I think a lot of the value we add, in addition to the tech, is having conversations with people, because there is a lot to get your head around. And we want to make sure that everyone really understands the commitments and that they're signing up to if they choose to register some forests. So this is why I think, Zeb, having, coming from your summit, I'm really curious to know what are the questions, what are the concerns or thoughts that farmers and other landholders were raising with regards to this.
One thing, because we did have a good discussion after watching your video, was just like, what an example on our property, we've got north-south hedgerows between all our paddocks. It's really neat farm, and 5 hectare paddocks with hedgerows all through that, and yet the ETS is quite prescriptive to what actually sequesters carbon. And so if you totaled all our hedgerows up, that would be quite a block of that would be a fairly substantial forestry block. But individually, it's not 30 meters wide and the other stipulations, so it doesn't count. And I just, so it was a bit of like, what change could be made to incorporate some of this other stuff, which isn't, right now qualify as the ETS.
Yeah,
Patrick?
That's a tough one, isn't it? Yeah, I can understand where you're coming from, and you're definitely not the only one who's sort of, has these perfectly good trees growing on their property, and they just don't quite meet the requirements. I think in terms of the requirements to register forest lands, like you say, the block has to be more than 30 meters wide, has to be at least 1 hectare in size, and has to be a tree species that has potential to grow more than 5 meters in height in the position where it's located. And these rules, they weren't just pulled out of thin air. I think they come from like some other government forest prescription that is kind of used on a nationwide kind of mapping classification.
It's actually international. So under the Kyoto Agreement, everyone's like, Kyoto basically said, you get recognition for the new forest you create. And that's where this 1990 number comes from as well. Like, it's what you had before 1990, that's the old stuff. What you have after 1990, that's the new stuff. But you also get to decide what's forest in your country. And so there's like sliders for how high does it have to be, how much area does it have to cover, how wide does it have to be, and what canopy cover extent does it have to be. And New Zealand picked at pretty much the top end of the scale for all of those things. And the reason that this matters is that while it also limits what you get credit for creating, it also controls what you get penalized for removing. So while it's like a pain in the neck that you don't get any credit for your shelter belt, converse is that if you decide that you need to knock down the shelter belt that you had there in the 80s, no one's going to come and issue you a compliance violation notice. And it's a lot of it is around like this, the difficulty and the complexity of monitoring activities. And even just the practicality of it. Like, can you really, especially with the sort of technology of old when this was happening, can you practically go and monitor everybody's hedges? But that's starting to change a little bit, and we're getting closer to a stage where an individual landholder could decide whether, like, oh, you know what, I am going to create a new hedge here, and I do want it registered in the scheme, and I do accept the responsibilities that puts on me to not cut it down. Like, I'm in, register it.
And also, you know, under He Waka Eke Noa, well, one of the options being proposed is the recognition of on-farm sequestration through vegetation, and that will include a lot of vegetation types that aren't necessarily eligible for the ETS. So, yeah, shelter belts, riparian plantings, scattered kind of trees, that sort of thing, will be able to be used to offset on-farm emissions under one of the proposed options there. The other one being a more sort of processor-based levy, which personally I don't think would be as good an option. It doesn't really seem to incentivize on-farm behaviour change, which is really the key to reducing emissions at the industry level.
How about like crops? We had two talks during the summer. One, Peter from Miscanthus NZ, and the other Brad, who's really involved in growing hemp in the South Island. And Miscanthus had a figure of 30 tons of biomass per hectare annually that would produce. You know, that's a lot of carbon. Should someone growing a crop of Miscanthus not be rewarded, or could there be a way that could be the case in the future?
Yeah, it's a very tricky one, and there's not just the biomass that's above ground. There's also sort of soil carbon and this kind of thing. And I'd say, like, yes, you can't rule it out or nor would we want to rule it out. Like, if there's genuine good that can be done. There are a couple of tricky concepts that get introduced around additionality. Like, you ideally don't want to be giving people carbon credits for something that they were going to do anyway, which is why, for example, fruit trees under the emissions trading scheme are not eligible for carbon credits, even if they grow above 5 meters tall, et cetera, because they're not there because you're trying to sequester carbon. They're there because you're growing apples or whatever it is. And there's sort of a different, like, you're just trying to cash in rather than actually trying to have some sort of net beneficial environmental impact. So that's part of it. Another one is the durability. Like, a lot of the time, the expectation is that with a crop, you've grown it as a crop and you're probably going to clear it at the end of the year. So you might have soaked up, 30 tons for the year, but you didn't do it for very long. And under the ETS, it's like, you got to do it forever. So if you apply the ETS rules just as they sit vanilla to an annual crop, you'd grow it, get your 30 tons, get issued your 30 tons of credits, and then in the same year, you'd get rid of it all and have to give it all back again. There's a lot of different ways to skin that, and you can have sort of like actually recognize the temporal element, and maybe you kind of like, usually a carbon credit is deemed to be for 100 years of sequestration. So if you sequester it for 100 years, you might argue that you should get 100 of it then, like, you've still done some good, and it's net good. But and other parts of it is just practicalities, like, can you actually measure it and reliably prove it? Because these markets are hugely sensitive to any kind of lack of integrity, because you're selling someone a promise. It's not like you ship them the ton of carbon. You're selling them a promise that the amount that they've bought is definitely there, and you'll definitely keep it there for the long term, and that it's definitely real. And if any of one of those things starts to fall over, then you end up with on really shaky territory, and people lose confidence entirely, and the price collapses, and you don't have a good incentive effect anymore, which is where we are with some of these sort of the more dubious international deforestation prevention credits, which are extremely cheap because they generally have lost integrity. And so I think, like, let a million flowers bloom kind of thing. Like, I'd love to see more access for more genuine sorts of sequestration across the whole spectrum, including especially soil carbon. I mean, that's an enormous potential resource, be fantastic. It's just, you've got to do it in a way that it works both ways. If you register your land for soil carbon and there's a big storm and a whole bunch of your topsoil gets lost, someone's probably going to come knocking and saying, hey, give me it back. Like you said, for 100 years and now it's gone. So managing those risks and things as well is extremely important in the methodology design.
Yeah, some of us regenerative farmers that are calling out for soil carbon to be included, you've got to be careful what you wish for, because right now in Southland we're going through a major drought, and you can't do much about drought and how that will affect your soil carbon. Yeah,
but I still think, though, that even despite that, there's ways to solve that. And there's things like, rather than you get 100 years, it's sort of like you get paid every year for every ton. Like, because I don't know much about regenerative agriculture, but what I've seen makes me really excited about it in terms of the sort of sequestration potential and the additional impacts that it has on soil health and everything else. Like, we should definitely figure out a way to get people who are effectively, carbon farming for soil carbon and health, like, find a way to help direct economic incentives to making that happen more. Tricky.
Right now, I look out my window and I see James Cook. He's digging up my backyard and he's burying logs. We're starting a hugel culture. I'm constantly turning my lawn into garden, and so this is burying a bunch of worn down logs, and then we'll cover it with smaller branches, and then just some mulch, and then cover back with the soil that he's dug up. So this is a very small scale, but we could do this on a larger scale, and that's got to be 100 years of carbon getting stored away. Right, and I'm thinking there's no way to get this hugel mound in the ETS, but is there another market? People talk about the voluntary market. I wonder, like, what your thoughts are there, or what that even is, or how might something like this exploration into hugel cultures and backyards be accredited for carbon?
Yeah. Well, firstly, that sounds super interesting. I'd like to ask you 100 questions about what hugel cultures are and how they work and whatnot. But so it's not like they could never be in the ETS. There's no law that says that the New Zealand ETS shall never accept other things like soil carbon or wetland carbon or whatever. It's just what's practical and accessible and has the sort of appropriate political will behind it and that kind of thing. And I mean, there's been a lot of discussions that I'm aware of in New Zealand about biochar, which is because, like, if you've got a whole heap of trees, like a big forest, and you go and cut it down and you've been issued carbon credits, the moment you cut it down, you have to give 100% of your carbon credits back, basically, because it's all gone. And a lot of people look at that and go, well, what the hell? Like, the trees are still there. It's not like I set them on fire. I just cut them down and they're off to be stored in a house or whatever. But the point is, nobody knows that. What they can see is that the trees are gone. They don't know where they're going to go next. But you could, for example, cut down all of the trees. The person who had the trees has to give all the carbon credits back. But someone buys those logs, takes them somewhere and buries them all in the ground and sort of, sequesters it under the soil. In my view, if you can measure that, they should be then given carbon credits because they're now sequestering carbon in a durable way. And sort of segue into voluntary markets, like, ultimately, they're trying to incentivize the same things in similar ways. There's no one there with a stick so much saying you have to do this. So there's different levels of demand. But on the because they're less regulated, there's an enormously greater potential for innovation and sort of rapid iteration of new approaches, and that can. We're sort of doing some stuff that we're extremely excited about in some of the categories of forest that have been historically very difficult for the ETS to recognise for various reasons, and it's a tragedy because in many respects they're the kinds of forest that we would most want to direct carbon finance to, like the sort of early stage high biodiversity regeneration. Like that is the gold stuff. It is tragic when it gets cleared to be planted with pines, but it's tricky. So it sort of tends to have been, it's not the low-hanging fruit, as Patrick mentioned earlier, but it's getting there, and as tech gets better and the understanding and the science gets better, the options get better. And I think the same will be true for soil carbon. Sort of, I guess it's another variant of soil carbon, but through quite a different sequestration mechanism, like basically burying stuff that's got carbon in it and then trying to create some sort of subsurface environment that's suitable for long-term sequestration. But and the really interesting thing is those markets are just taking off now. There is more and more demand for this stuff, the voluntary credits, if you can prove to a very high confidence level that it's for real. Like because people have been burned so many times with just junk claims, and there's all sorts of stuff happening on the international market. So where we're really focusing is like we want to issue voluntary credits that are different to the ETS credits, except in almost every respect, we want them to be higher integrity than the ETS credits. Because not that the ETS is bad, we just know that it's got, limitations, and we think we can fix them, and we can do so in a quicker way than sort of waiting for another several iterations of ETS development. And that could be replicated across other sectors. Like we're not currently working on soil carbon. If we suddenly get a huge amount of spare time, then it would be hugely interesting, but I can't see it happening. But fantastic if somebody else sort of has the opportunity to innovate in that space, come up with a new solution that's robust and demonstrable and can be proven over time. And people are working on it, for sure.
Yes, some of our clients are working on soil carbon projects, so it would be interesting to see, how that goes, implementing regenerative farming practices on a more conventional operation. So I think there's questions in the New Zealand context because traditionally we've always had quite high levels of soil carbon. So, there's a certain upper threshold there about how much carbon the soil can actually take. But it'll be interesting to see how that goes. And kind of going back to hugelkultur, my dad actually did a crop of pumpkins using that method, and it worked out really well. So hopefully it goes good for you as well, Zeb. And also talking about kind of along those lines is there was talk of introducing into the ETS a couple of years ago some recognition of, like Nick was talking about, harvested wood products. So a recognition that when you chop a tree down, all that CO2 within the tree is not instantly lost to the atmosphere. Some of it gets stored as framing timber or hugelkultur, whatever. It doesn't just go straight up as CO2 again. Unfortunately, it never really got implemented, but it was on the cards. I think, being a government-sponsored sort of scheme that they have to monitor and manage, it was probably put into the too hard basket, and that's where these alternative schemes can really fill that void, being more flexible. And if they can prove that there's genuine carbon sequestration, there's no reason why some of these other methods couldn't receive recognition as well.
Cool. Part of my issue with the carbon market and the ETS is just about this reductionism, and it's sort of steering this huge complex issue that we're facing about environmental degradation down to this single figure just to allow for accounting. And I'm very inspired by the works of like Walter Yene or Charles Eisenstein, who more talk on this whole systems. And it's part of why I really value what you're doing, which is using this system that is a setup, this accounting framework for carbon, and putting it to use, which to enhance biodiversity, which will enhance water quality. But are those different conversations, or is there a way that those values, biodiversity, water quality, air quality, could they be brought into this sort of market scheme, or would that be something that's separate?
Yeah, really great question. And it's actually surprising, well, maybe not surprising, but the number of landholders we've talked to who have reservations just because they're sort of, I'm keen, but I don't want to be complicit in some greenwashing, dodgy stuff. Like, is this legit? And there's everything you talked about, but another one that they're often concerned about is like, I didn't create this forest, like my blood, sweat, and tears, so that someone could drive a sort of, fly first class all over the place and like leave their heaters on and not insulate their house. Like, I want reductions, and it's a super fair point, but they're somewhat separate. So there's two numbers in the ETS. There's like, it's really what's the total number of carbon credits that we need, but that's whatever number that is. It's not so much a problem with like trees. Trees are still really good. They still sequester carbon. The number that you need to worry about is how many carbon credits are we putting into this system that aren't backed by any trees. They're just the made up ones where it's like, knock yourself out, emit. And in New Zealand, as I said before, I'm not actually sure off the top of my head exactly what that number is, but it's about sort of 20 to 40 million tons a year, whether you're talking about stuff that's exempt from the ETS or included in the ETS. And that's the number you want to reduce. Like when New Zealand talks about being zero carbon in 2050, they're not talking about never having anything that emits any carbon. They're talking about not putting anything into the ETS, which isn't backed by something being sucked out of the atmosphere. So you sort of end up with integrity in terms of we're zero emissions, but it's not by never having an emission. We're by, actually cleaning up after ourselves every bit of mess we make. On the biodiversity side of it, like, again, really complicated topic and a hugely emotional one as well. And like, we're sort of philosophically, I think everyone in CarbonCrop is on the same page of like, we realize that it's very reductionist. We're just saying this, you get paid for this one number. And there's like so much other things you're doing as well. But you can sort of flip it around and say, finally, there's a way you can get paid for this stuff. Like before, there were no numbers. Now there's one number which is measurable, is correlated, or at least can be, with all of these really good things. And someone will front up with cash. And so there's still perverse outcomes. You can have the one number for the carbon, which is very good, and really bad numbers for everything else, like massive wilding pine infestation. But you kind of just need to go, oh, well, that's a failure case. Let's figure out how to exclude that one and make sure that we're mostly issuing carbon credits for good things. I think it's really good that it's correlated with other positive environmental indicators as well. I kind of would be quite keen to see separate biodiversity credits being created for those things too, because often we've ended up in discussions where people will say, why isn't there like you get more carbon for your tree if it's a high biodiversity tree? And it's like, because that's a different thing. It doesn't have more carbon. You shouldn't be allowed to drive your car twice as far because of that tree, just because it's a high biodiversity tree. It's like, it should be a separate thing, which is tracked separately, that it's a good biodiversity tree. And the other reason that I think that's super important is that there's a lot of landscapes in New Zealand which, like, the dearest to my heart, are extremely low carbon sequestration landscapes, especially in terms of rate. Like for me, the spots I love the most, like I love going tramping in the Southern Alps, and I love beech forest, but the part I love the most is when you finally get up to the tops and you're out in the tussock lands. And those are like hugely valuable landscapes, really sensitive, sequester almost no carbon. But so if you just kind of gave stuff credits based on, oh, you get carbon, and also if you biodiversity, then you get a little bit better, you deny them any source of kind of biodiversity recognition at all, because they don't sequester a lot of carbon. Whereas if you had a biodiversity credit, you go, fantastic high alpine meadow, bugger all carbon, but awesome ecosystem, lots and lots of money can go to that as well. So it's just I'd love to see a separate market for biodiversity and ecosystem health that could be funded in a similar way. But if you conflate it just with tons of carbon, you can end up with these really weird effects that are usually the result of the best possible intentions, but it's sort of a different thing. I do think, though, that you shouldn't give dollars for carbon to something which is just overtly bad. Like it's like, oh, well, at least it sucked a lot of carbon out of the air. We're sort of talking wilding pine categories here. It's like, yeah, but we don't want more of that. Biodiversity credits could be a way to that. It's like, yep, you get $100 worth of carbon, but you owe me $120 for your destruction of biodiversity across this area. So friggin' cut it out. But yeah, we don't have that yet.
I've actually heard of examples of just that, and I don't have many good things to say about the emissions reduction efforts in Australia, but one of the things that I've heard coming out of there is like a literal biodiversity credit, and it equates to, a certain area of quote unquote protected land, which is there for conservation purposes. So there are products out there, and hopefully we can get something along those lines in this country as well.
Yeah. I don't know if we strayed off topic of it. Sorry, missed that.
No, it's great, man. It's great. And we are nearing the end of our time. So I just, part of your 5-minute video, and I won't ask you to repeat these numbers, but like the opportunity here is huge. I'm sure there was something like the value that we could get is double DOC's annual budget, and it's like double what the Billion Trees program was worth. So I just wonder if you could round out with some like, this is the opportunity, these are the actions that people listening to this or watching could take.
Yeah, sure. Honestly, that was the first time I'd done that calculation as a comparison with the DOC budget and with the 1 billion trees funding, and I was like, man, that's it kind of, I'd expected it to be significant, but I hadn't expected it to be twice DOC's annual budget, and it really does highlight the opportunity. So the rough numbers that we would use is, if we want to make real progress here, and this is also the reason for urgency, is like, it's not enough to kind of create 10 or 20,000 hectares of new native forest each year, which is what some of the targets are. Like, you do that for 20 years, you've got 500,000 hectares of forest, and it's 20 years later from now, and we're in deep trouble. We'd really want to see like 1 million plus hectares by the end of the decade, ideally. That means 100,000 hectares a year, and probably the only way you're going to get that is with massive encouragement of natural regeneration as well. But whatever way you get there, and however long it takes you to get there, broadly speaking, if you've got 1 million hectares of forest, you can get about 6 million tons a year of carbon out of the atmosphere with that. And 6 million tons a year of carbon is at the sort of $100 a ton level, which is rapidly the direction things are going, especially for the sort of high integrity credits. That's $600 million a year. So you'd sort of, I think I was talking about 1.1 billion in the video, and that was using slightly higher sequestration rates, which are actually entirely possible. Like, I'm talking six tons per hectare per year here. Totara, once it actually gets and sort of hits its straps, it can do 20, 25. We should be aiming for really more than 1 million hectares. It should be like 1.5 million hectares. And if it's like, so let's say it's 1.5 million hectares, and it's actually getting its way towards sort of a succession species, and you're doing 15 tons a year. Now that's, I have to do maths, 22.5 million tons a year of carbon at $100 a ton is $2.25 billion a year of money that's going to these people in recognition of the forest they're restoring. And so I think I said 1.1 billion in the other video. It all is like, none of these dimensions are certain yet. There's lots of variables, but the key thing is like, it's enormous. It dwarfs any other sort of restoration budget that we have in New Zealand at the moment. It's all entirely aligned with positive things that we want to happen, as long as we don't fall into traps of like accidentally having it all being unmanaged pines. And to make it happen, like really, I think it's down to individual landholders to explore and understand the opportunity for themselves, because to a huge extent, people are already doing it. They're often just not getting any recognition for it at all. And the moment you begin to like connect up the little loop, then you get the feedback mechanisms like, well, now you're being paid for the first bit, which gives you some money to expand it and expand it and expand it. And yeah, I think the point that Natalie highlighted earlier with, we don't charge for this. Like, it's free. You can come to our website. We'll give you all the information for free. You then have to decide what you're going to do, and you can continue with us. But even if you don't, we're still happy that you kind of learned what the opportunity was and how to access it. And yeah, it's serious numbers.
Yeah, and Nick, could you just make it real for like a regular landholder, what do all those billions and millions mean for me and my farm, for instance, if I've got
rough numbers, like we tend to talk about on the order of $1,000 a hectare in annual revenue for regeneration is entirely realistic. And it's easy to do quite a bit more than that if you've actually got a planted forest with certain species at a certain age. Like it takes a little bit of time to get started if you've got nothing. Like you don't get that much in the early years, but that's entirely realistic. And that's at roughly current day carbon prices. Once they go up, you get paid more. And we're not saying like plant out your flats. It's like do this on the land that's should be in forest. It's like hard to farm, unproductive, unstable. You wouldn't want to log it even. And there's a lot of that land, like well over 1.5 million hectares in New Zealand is in that kind of category of what were you even doing there? Like that could be a massive resource. And as it is, it kind of slides into the river every time it rains, and it's raining more and more often, harder and harder. Yeah.
I think that really grounds it. And yeah, during the week I was up in the Hawke's Bay for the summit, I think we had about 200 mils of rainfall, and then I've come back to the farm in Southland and we haven't had rain in about 6 weeks. So it's just like it's a very felt experience, the way that the climate is changing. So I think things like the ETS that do empower people that are sequestering carbon and addressing it from that angle is awesome. And I love that your work is empowering not just the reduced figure around carbon, but also some of this biodiversity and the flow-ons to just general environmental health. So it's been really good to take a deeper dive with you guys. It's CarbonCrop. I do recommend anyone listening to this to get on the website and at least have a play around. And if you've got a farm, then free assessments is literally no obligation. So I do encourage you to do that.
Zeb, thank you so much. It's been lovely spending time with you, and really appreciate you inviting us into Future Whenua and being part of that really exciting collaboration that's unfolding. So yeah, thanks again. We're going to share some more resources on the website, and just please, if anyone's watching this and they have other questions that we haven't answered and they'd like more content, then please let us know. We're going to do our best to help answer those questions.
I just want to say thanks to you as well, Zeb, and props for all that you're doing to bring together these communities of people as well, because none of this stuff really works in isolation. You need like-minded, sort of collaboration between groups is what it's all about. And I think that's how it's got to the stage it's at, and that's how it's going to keep going. So thanks for letting us be a part of it.
Yeah, likewise, Zeb. Great to meet you today. It makes me, just hearing your talk makes me sad that I missed out on the summit, but hopefully next year, if Nick wants to contribute to the CarbonCrop excursion.
Yeah, definitely.
It'll be March down in Southland. Yeah.
Cool.
Awesome talking with you guys.
Cheers, Zeb. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Zeb. Cheers.
Talk to you later.